If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who explore abandoned buildings. What was your duck this, I'm out moment, while exploring? I used to be heavy into urban exploration primarily in Alaska and Arizona during my peak. In Arizona there is a town called Two Guns that has been bought, sold, developed, and abandoned more than 20x in the past 50 years, which has led to some local folklore about it being haunted. Now, there's the developed section of Two Guns that is comprised of old derelict buildings, abandoned swimming pools, half-constructed edifices that have fallen into ruin in their desuetude, the expected. Nothing spooky here. Then, there is another area on the outskirts which has what, I found out later, are known locally as Apache death caves. They are twisting, vermicular caverns that yawn up from the earth, full of jagged edges like the sharp-toothed maw of the earth's darker interiors. The scariest aspect is how suddenly they appear in the ground. If one was covered by even a thin layer of brush or a light dusting of snow that collected, it's easy to see how one would fall to their death without any forewarning. I approached one on my belly and took a few pictures with flash, exposing the interior, which to the naked eye just looks like a jet black pit that swallows up all light. The appearance and risk of falling into them was not what haunted me about them, though rather, it was the sound emitted from them even in the absence of surrounding input. A hollow, deep-bellied, albeit faint roar, or more like a moan, could be heard coming from their innards. It was as if the wind was sucked into its corridors, translated into some non-Euclidean, nameless horror of a language, and projected back out as the sound of 1,000 tremulous souls caught in the eternal horror of its bowels. The flash revealed a set of bones, pristine save a light dusting of dirt, which led me to believe even insects avoided flying into their open maws. I later read that the Apache Indians would use these caverns as traps for horsemen during raids and attacks during the expanse across the west by colonist settlers. I cannot begin to imagine dying in such a way, surrounded by the pitch black, the sounds of screams and groans echoing into an eternity of maddening terror as the air and light of the world is violently wrenched away and replaced with agony and isolation. One may as well have just been buried alive in an Iron Maiden. My exploration partner and I left at nightfall and never returned. A group of us went into an old abandoned care home. We got in legally. It was pitch black, and I mean the type of darkness where you cannot see your hand in front of your face even when you let your eyes adjust. Fortunately, we had a few light sources with us. After walking around and finding copious amounts of evidence that there was squatters staying there, not at the time of our arrival, thank God, we found ourselves standing in a room filled with graffiti, but not graffiti from a paint can. This was spelled in dried blood and excrement. The stench was horrendous. We got out of there so quick and have never been back since. Was exploring an abandoned asylum in Scotland, and it wasn't so bad because all the roofs and floors had collapsed and it was all pretty open and you could literally run in any direction to get out, except on the way out I saw this little square opening in the foundations that was a little bit narrower than my shoulders but and about 1.5 feet long. So I stuck my head in with a head torch on and started looking around inside. Not much to see but a roughly 10 feet corridor with a turn at the end and a couple of inches of water. I said something to one of my buddies standing at my feet and noticed that there was a pretty cool echo when I spoke, so I started making all the usual random sounds you make when playing with an echoey environment until I heard a very distinctive slosh of water, exactly like someone going from standing stock still in the shallow water to taking a step in my direction from just round the corner of the corridor. I've never launched myself backwards from the prone position faster in my life. This is a long one, so there is a TL, doctor at the end. In my old neighborhood, there was an old, burnt out house with a ghost story attached to it, which I will share at the end. I heard it all the time growing up and never believed it. After all, I was a Trekkie. So everything had to have a logical, scientific explanation. I joined a band as a young adult, with a guy that claimed to be a medium. We had a number of discussions, but never changed each other's minds. One day, we wanted to take pictures. We wanted an abandoned building. So I suggested the old house from my old neighborhood. I never told anyone in the band the ghost story, and my hometown was an hour from where we rehearsed. So we loaded up, and went down to the old, burnt out house. We got some great stuff on the first floor, then went upstairs. We're setting up in one room, when the photographer asks, "Hey, D, you good?" D was the medium. D was really quiet, staring into space, and he had his crucifix out. He was rubbing that thing. D looks over and goes, "Guys, we need to leave." We ask him why, and he says, in the coldest voice I've ever heard, "I'm communicating with a spirit right now. And she says we have to leave." I laughed and said, "Yeah, right. You're scared of some ghost girl?" D looks me dead in the eye and says it is a little girl. And she's not the one we need to worry about. It's the man in the back. He's coming. Dude. Every hair on my body stood at attention. I don't remember leaving the room. Or going downstairs. The next thing I knew was I'm sitting on the grass 50 yards from the house, puffing on a cigarette like my life depended on it. You see, Reddit, the ghost story is as follows. Back in the late 30s, the man that lived in that house was kidnapping and raping young girls. He picked one particular little girl who fought back when he tried to force himself on her in the house. She fought him so hard that he stabbed her before going to his room to pass out. She wasn't dead yet, and kicked over the oil lamp in the room. Both were killed in the fire. But the rash of attacks on young girls in town stopped. The limited forensics of the time period confirmed that the fire was in her room and she had stab wounds. Now, her ghost is inhabit the shell of the house. He is a malevolent spirit. She is a benevolent one, who has consigned herself to containing his presence. But when trespassers enter the room where he raped his victims, he will be drawn to them. She will try to ward trespassers away, going so far as to manifest herself when people are especially stubborn. I told the guys the story, and ended up sitting down for lessons on the spiritual realm with D. Needless to say, I believe in ghosts now. Danvers State Mental Hospital. Stumbling across an overgrown graveyard full of tiny little headstones with nothing but patient numbers, no names, no dates. The overwhelming inhumanity that all of those nameless graves represented hit me at once. I'm not easily frightened, and exploring an abandoned mental institution in the middle of the night had been an exciting adventure until that discovery. Even then, I wasn't afraid. Deeply saddened and nauseated, I lost my curiosity. I felt ashamed to be intruding on a space that had seen levels of human cruelty and suffering far beyond what I could ever imagine, so I left and never went back. When I was in high school, me and a bunch of friends piled into my friend's car and drove up to some abandoned houses near our town. The houses were bought by a big company to tear them down to build more office space, but the project was abandoned and the houses were never torn down. They had been empty for about 20 years at that point. I really didn't want to go, but I had just gotten into the cool crowd and I wanted to fit in, so I went along. The houses were falling apart, covered in graffiti and trash, and it was dead silent and pitch dark out. The only light we had were our cell phone flashlights. Most of us were terrified, but a few of the older boys were being rowdy and making a lot of noise. I told them to shut up because I didn't want the cops to come, and I knew this was also a hot spot for squatters and I didn't want us to get robbed and or murdered. The whole time I kept feeling like I was hearing shit behind me, but I tried to brush it off thinking it was just my imagination. About the third house we went to, I found an old Victorian doll covered in dust and cobwebs on the staircase. I don't know why, but I picked it up to look at it. It was creepy as all duck, one eye missing and matted hair and torn clothing. I quickly put it down and walked away to continue exploring. A few minutes later, in dead silence besides our footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors, we heard, "Mama," in a soft child's voice, coming from the doll. I looked at my friends. They looked at me. We hightailed it back to the car and sped away. Never went back after that. Not an abandoned building, but I saw something as a 12-year-old with my best friend at the time and younger brother that still cannot be explained. My family lived right outside of Wilmington at the time. Behind our backyard fence was a huge cornfield and we would play there every day. We built forts and would shoot corn kernels at each other from slingshots. We were dumb but soon found paintballing. Anyway, there was a few patches of woods in the cornfield and we had explored every corner, occasionally coming across fire pits with toilet paper rolls and clothes scattered around. We once got chased from one of those spots by a crazy woman who looked like a junkie extra from The Wire. Well, one night we were out in the cornfield, there were tons of stars out and a very bright moon, possibly full, can't totally remember. This was after harvest because there were no stalks obstructing our views. As we were walking and talking, we heard a loud rustling coming from the direction of the woods our fort was in. As the noise continued, our curiosity piqued, so naturally we started moving towards it. Again, we were idiots. We moved into about 50 yards away when we saw what looked like a dog start to run on 4 legs parallel to us but maintaining the same distance. This thing was long but very slender, like the build of a Great Dane. Obviously this spooked us and we began to retreat, backpedaling while continuing to face whatever this creature was. As we got to within 20 yards from my backyard fence, the creature stood up on 2 legs and started to run again as fast as it moved on 4 legs. We all just kind of stood there staring but literally speechless. After a few seconds passed, I told them we need to climb the fence and haul us back home. At no point did it feel like a threat to us. It kept its distance but it moved very swiftly. To this day none of us have any ducking clue what we saw, but we all agree we saw the same thing. We lived in a residential area not far from the city of Wilmington, so although it's possible it was a black bear, it moved so fast, and having lived in CO in the mountains of NWSC, I've had many run-ins with bears. If anyone has any theories, I'm open to it. It has been 20 years and I still don't know WTF I saw. I grew up in a very small town nestled in a large sprawling pine forest. When I was in high school, a few friends and I were hanging out at our friend's house right on the edge of the woods. We'd been hanging out and watching movies all night and it was getting late, but being teenagers none of us were tired, so the friend whose house it was told about an abandoned house in the woods that's supposedly haunted. I was bored and a tad cocky, so I said we should all go check it out. It took some convincing, but finally all three of my friends were on board and we set off into the woods in the middle of the night with nothing but our cell phones for light and some Nerf guns I had in my trunk because I thought it'd be fun to run around an abandoned house shooting each other. After some time wandering through the woods, we find the place, sitting alone in top of a little hill. The house itself wasn't too old or run down. The 2008 financial crisis hit our town especially hard, so I reasoned that it was probably a house built within the last 20 years or so that was just foreclosed on and abandoned when the housing market crashed. Because the house was situated on a hill, we entered through the basement. Nothing unexpected down there, just some broken bottles and graffiti. We moved slowly up the creaking stairs to the main floor. Again, nothing out of the ordinary there, just some broken windows, empty beer bottles, the dishwasher was ripped halfway out and chained to a drawer. Definitely got the sense it was just a place used for partying. We're about to leave when I see that there's an attic. We've come this far, so naturally I have to check it out. However, right at this point the hair starts to stand up on the back of our necks and this feeling that something is off sets in. One other friend and I push past the feeling and head up the stairs to the attic. When we get up the stairs, we see it's actually a whole third floor with 3 rooms, each of which is closed. In an act of bravado, I kick open the first door and find a completely empty room with nothing but an old-looking wooden chair directly in the center of the room, facing a big bay window that looks out at another house off in the distance. Spooky feeling intensifies, but I'm not going to stop until I've seen every inch of the house. My friend and I move to the next room, nothing out of the ordinary there but some mangled bed frames. On to the last room. There's a brownish red stain on the door, but it's dark and logically it's probably just a paint splatter from some other teenagers trying to scare us, so we shrug it off and enter the room. With both disappointment and relief, we see there's nothing out of the ordinary there, so my friend and I turn to leave, but on our way back to the stairs we see a 4th room we hadn't seen before, a small half bathroom with the door open. In the dim light from my cell phone flashlight I can see that there's something weird about the back wall to the bathroom. I pick up a board that's laying on the ground and push on the wall. It swings open to reveal a small but fully stocked little girl's room. Clothes hanging in the closet. Pink kid bed with a flowery pink bedspread on it that looks like it was just slept in. Tiny flowery lamp on an end table in the corner. At this point every fiber in my being is screaming at me to get out immediately, because I reason that I either stumbled on a pedophile den or the room of a dead little girl that the parents couldn't stand to enter after she passed. I wasn't equipped to deal with the ghost of a dead kid or a pedo kidnapper, so I promptly got the duck out of there. Weeks later I tried to return to the house in the daylight with my sister, but I got lost in the woods and couldn't find it. I still think about it almost 10 years later. I was exploring an old abandoned TB hospital that was later a hospital for mentally ill youth with some friends. It was located kind of on a hill, in a wooded area removed from the nearby main roads, and we had to slip under a fence to access the property. Everything went pretty well most of our exploration. There were some eerie remnants of its former life, like empty rooms with lone rocking horses, an old stage/theater, and those weird metal bed things used for embalming or perhaps just washing patients down. On the 3rd or 4th floor, there was a room labeled morgue in spray paint. One of my buddies and I decided to check it out, and upon entry it looked to be some sort of power control room with big fuses arrayed across a bunch of big control boards. We walked in for a closer look with our flashlights, when suddenly the big steel door slammed shut behind us. The damn thing no longer had a knob or handle on our side, so there was no way for us to get out. We started pounding somewhat anxiously on the door to get our other friends' attention, when I started hearing movement and fuses popping out of their sockets and clattering to the ground. Not long after, our friends heard and were able to get the door open from the other side. That was kind of our cue to wrap things up, since that situation could have been pretty ugly if we didn't have other people in the place to hear us. As for the door, noises, and fuses, in hindsight I attribute them to natural phenomenon. Perhaps the door hinges were warped and the banging on the door may have made some of the fuses pop out of the boards. Still pretty damn creepy in the moment though. Had just helped my friend leave the abandoned World War II fort, which is a mile down a private, fenced-off road that goes through a concrete works and has a difficult-to-cross moat, by giving him a leg up to the hole in the ceiling. He was up and I couldn't reach it. Then, out of nowhere, Two men come through a doorway and approach me asking me what I'm up to. My friend, luckily, heard them and got back down to make sure I was okay. Turns out they were paranormal investigators, and were staying the night to observe and see if anything came through. They asked if we wanted to stay with them. We said no and ducked off sharpish. Broke into an abandoned house in the village I grew up in England back when I was a teenager, maybe 15 years ago now. Was with a couple friends but broke off by myself and ventured upstairs. When I turned at the top of the stairs I saw a figure standing in the darkness just staring at me. I bolted out of the building as quickly as I could and my friends heard me and panicked. They weren't far behind. Went back there a couple of weeks later with a bigger group to prove my story, and to my embarrassment, it was a tall mirror at the top of the stairs. The figure I saw was me. Not my proudest moment. Late to the party but used to work for a guy renovating houses. He'd buy dumps for like 5 to 10,000 that had been abandoned for years. We'd fix them up, and he'd rent the houses out. His daughter would go to houses to take pictures after he bought them, since he'd buy a lot of them sight unseen because they were so cheap. One house she went to take pictures at and she was kinda creeped out by the basement and did not want to go in. She just opened the door, leaned in, reached her arm out and took a picture. When her dad reviewed the pictures he saw a man standing in the basement about 5 feet from the camera staring directly into it. Several years ago, a man was murdered in the city I was working in and parts of his body were turning up at various locations. I think his hand and foot had been found and a week had passed. I'm an architectural designer and I was surveying an abandoned chapel that was slated to be renovated into condos. It was apparent that homeless people had been squatting in the chapel, but I wasn't sure how recently they had been there. When I went into the basement though, it was clear someone was either there or had just left based on the smell. There were no lights due to the power being cut and I didn't stick around long enough to see if anyone was currently occupying the space. 2 days later someone reported that they found the torso and head of the murdered man in a building attached to the chapel. I had been too freaked out by the smell in the basement to continue on to the attached building. But I'm almost certain I would have been the one to find the body. I was invited to a farmhouse on someone's property, their old house which was mostly empty. I found the place and walked in alone. It had the feel of a 50s 4-level split but in a 1980s renovated way. Everything was fine until I got to the top floor. I was completely overtaken with terror for no logical reason. I'm a fairly smart and rational person. I can't explain this, but I felt I was in the presence of something evil, something that would completely crush me if it could. This sense of doom and dread hit me so hard, I ran down the stairs with my camera and out the door and hopped in my car and drove away fast. I parked at the top of the hill where I could still see the farmhouse. I looked at it and I wanted to laugh at myself, to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't. It felt far too real. I got in my car and drove to the nearest town. Went into a gas station, trying to forget the feeling, wondering if everyone could see it on my face somehow. I grabbed some bad food and went back to my car. I climbed in, sat down and began to weep. I can't explain this. It was likely my mind or subconscious messing with me, but part of me is still convinced I encountered something awful that day. There was a coffin, a real coffin. We were in an abandoned factory that some rich family had owned, and there was this one room with a bunch of personal stuff, letters from the 50s, furniture, old photographs, clothes, even booze, like someone's home had been put in there. In the middle of it all a coffin. I swear. The room was gloomy, it was a late summer afternoon, no power and we didn't have flashlights. My friend was like, we gotta open this coffin, we can't leave unless we do, we gotta, and straight up lifted the lid. A sweet smell came from the darkness. When my grandmother died I was the one to find the corpse and I remember that one quite well. So my heart skipped a couple of beats. The coffin was full of candles. They had a sweet smell. Stumbled upon an arson in progress. And didn't realize it until the place was burned down the next day. My friends and I used to explore a lot of abandoned places many years back, still do from time to time, and our favorite place to visit was Woodville State Hospital in Pittsburgh. For a couple years we would make frequent trips up there and sneak in and explore. It was so massive, there was always something different to check out. Well, one evening we go up there and we hear noises, like someone breaking things. We figure it's a couple other kids just being assholes and vandalizing things. But when we tried to find who was responsible, we couldn't find anyone around. Apparently they noticed us and decided to sneak away before we got too close to the main building. We didn't think too much of it until we got inside the main building, the one with the giant bell tower and chapel and such. The entire main room had been filled with debris. And this was a huge room. Broken pianos and tables and chairs and pallets, etc., had all been dragged into this giant main room and scattered all around into a giant pile. This freaked us out quite a bit, as we recognized most of the items in the pile, and it would have taken a lot of effort, most definitely more than one person, to gather all of these items up from around the grounds and place them all in here. We didn't understand why people would do this, and it freaked us the duck out, so we ran out of there. The next day, shortly after sundown, I get a call from my best friend, all in a panic, yelling for me to turn on the news. So I tune in and see live coverage of Woodville burning to the ground. All of the big buildings had been set ablaze. The debris we saw getting piled up was used as fuel to commit arson. Apparently we interrupted them that day, so they fled and then did it the next day. As kids, we would walk this 1/4 mile railway tunnel near where I grew up. There were no tracks, but it was next to 2 live tunnels, so there was a slight element of danger. That and the fact it was trespassing, I guess, and railway workmen or transport police could catch us at any moment. So as you can imagine, it was dark, real dark in the middle, but towards the end there was enough light to barely see. One day we took an old school pal down there, and after walking the length, almost at the end of the tunnel, just as it was beginning to get light, he stopped to look down a large uncovered square 3 feet by 3 feet manhole. No, he didn't fall in, but after a flash of brief confusion he took in a deep breath and screamed, then immediately started sprinting for daylight. "Oh shit, duck roin!" he screams. Naturally, without question, we ran, having a hard time catching him up. At the mouth of the tunnel we stopped. All out of breath. WTF. "What's wrong? What did you see?" we asked. His face was pure white, and shaking, barely able to speak, he said there was someone down there, looking up at me. Now this buddy was and still is a good friend of mine, but back then he wasn't known for not being the sharpest tool in the drawer. Instantly we had an idea what just happened, but slowly we returned to open manhole. Then as the 4 of us stood around this hole looking down, sure enough, reflected in the still water about 5 feet down this feckin' hole was our 4 faces looking back up at us. My friends and I were exploring an abandoned military housing complex at night. It was in pretty bad shape, but there were lots of interesting things to see. We almost pissed ourselves a couple times because of mannequins behind doors and stuff. There was also a neat art installation with records hanging from the ceiling. Anyway, we climbed up some stairs to the tallest part of the building. We saw some faint light coming from under a door. Somehow the door had been booby-trapped, and as soon as my friend opened it there was a crash, and a cinder block on a rope that came swinging out the open door and just missed us. I got a split-second look inside where I saw a small fire, a mattress on the ground, and then a man moving quickly toward us. He was silhouetted by the light, so I couldn't make out what he looked like or what exactly he was holding, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I yelled, "Run!" and we bolted out of there as fast as our legs could carry us. I've been many places in the tri-state area and have experienced floors that are decaying. Once almost fell, thankfully was a very small drop, needles, animal corpses, etc. One time at a prison in NJ I saw a cell that was decked out with a decorated dollhouse, and you could tell someone was staying there. The creepiest experience I ever had was about 6 years ago. I was in an abandoned hospital in a residential part of NYC which had been abandoned less than a decade prior to our visit. Despite this, it was not a well-known location. We went at night and were exploring the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors all without issue and in total silence. There was little to no graffiti and everything was left: patient records and tissue samples, medicines, medical equipment. As we reached the 4th floor, we passed a random room that said no explosive gases can be used in this room. I read the sound aloud and we immediately heard a huge thud coming from inside that exact room. My blood ran cold and I literally froze because I felt that someone in that room was making themselves known. We ran out of there and heard slamming doors as we went down all the stairs. I have not been back there since, and it's now been sold and is being renovated into a housing complex. I still wonder what would have happened if we went into the room. There's an abandoned old cabin in the middle of the woods that's near my house. I believe it's from the early 1900s, and it's falling apart and blocked off by the rangers. But they don't really patrol this forest, so it's easy to jump the gate and hike up to the cabin. I decided to explore one day and climbed up the rotting deck to the main cabin. It was so dark and musty with broken glass and acorns everywhere. I went deeper into the cabin to explore the different rooms. As I was walking around, I started to hear a rustling noise. Me being a dumbass, I started to walk closer to the sound. I moved a rotting board over to the side and a ducking squirrel leapt out and attached itself to my sweater. I start screaming and grabbed the squirrel with my hands and threw it off me. I ran out of that cabin and never looked back. I still pass the cabin when I hike with my dog, but I've learned my lesson. It belongs to the forest now. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned mental facility that had been purchased by a large computer co. here in Silicon Valley. The compound was massive, it had its own sheriff, slaughterhouse, industrial mechanic shop, on-site homes for the employees, everything a small town would have, in addition to the hospital, school and a beautiful mansion. All but the mansion were being demolished. The hospital had some creepy, though typical of the time, rooms and equipment, etc. Went through every house, storage unit, outbuilding on the property and found some amazing things, with nothing negative of any kind happening. Then we went into the library. We went up a spiral staircase into the Belfry? I think that's what it's called. From the minute we entered the building I was nervous and uncomfortable. On the way up we'd passed rooms full of books and were going to check them out on the way out. There was no one else on the property, and the staircase was made of narrow metal stairs. From the top of the stairs you could see all the way to the bottom. We both heard footsteps coming up the stairs, but when we looked no one was there. We looked in all the rooms on the way down and nothing. There was no other way in or out. Suddenly I was filled with a terror I've never felt before or since. I'm not religious but began praying for my life. We left immediately and the feeling stopped once we left the building. My friend felt something, she said, but not to the level I did. No idea what happened there, but it was truly bizarre. The location was an abandoned municipal jail set up in the foothills of the mountains in a valley town in Utah, a fairly quiet area with a fair bit of history, and thus a lot of locations to explore. We were all college kids, ranging from freshmen to juniors, one of the latter being the type to barge into our apartment at 10 at night to invite us young and impressionable youths to go explore an abandoned prison. So of course my roommate and I say yes. When given the opportunity, what 18-year-old hopped up on reruns of X-Files wouldn't want to explore an abandoned jailhouse, especially one that was alleged to be haunted? We were stuffed 5 deep in his Mazda protege within minutes and en route. Upon arrival, we were greeted with a very ill-lit and overgrown fence, which we breached via a decent-sized hole. The frontage of the place was odd, lots of glass and 60s modern design but clearly untouched for decades save graffiti and broken bottles, dumped tires and the like. The layout was similarly strange, practically built into the side of the foothills, 2 stories but only the upper was immediately visible, the lower story half buried into the hillside and half exposed by design with an exercise yard fenced in at the bottom. We near the front entrance down and find that it's chain tight, so we proceed around the side and down a narrow flight of exterior stairs to an entrance without a door. The older of us go first, the rest of us piling up outside the doorway to wait for his signal. After about a minute, we hear the sound of gravel crunching loudly, followed by the sound of our brave leader sprinting full blast. He runs out of the building and up the stairs, leaving the rest of us to follow suit or figure out whatever spooked him the hard way. We, of course, sprint after him. After we reached the fence, he looks at us and said he was about to walk through a doorway when a stick got thrown through at him. He never saw what threw it, but it clearly wasn't something that could just happen without somebody doing the throwing, so he turned and ran without a second thought. We weighed our options. We halfway wanted to see what it was that threw the stick, however, we didn't want to get killed by whatever ghoul, hobo, or otherwise had done the throwing. So of course, we made a slow approach back toward the building, but with hopes of finding a different way in. Not halfway to the building we hear this freakish, unhuman-sounding moan, literally like whatever was making it was right beside us, but we knew it came from inside the jail. Without a word, we all stood, turned, and ran as fast as humanly possible through the hole in the fence back to the Mazda. Whatever or whoever made that sound was definitely not something we had any desire to see up close. In downtown Columbia, South Carolina, there used to be a condemned asylum. It burned down recently, but I was lucky enough to explore it a couple of years ago before the fire razed it. It hadn't been in use since the 1980s and truly became creepy over time. The main building and its supporting wings were 5 floors and created a complex with long, narrow, and sometimes dirt-floored basements linking all the buildings. The dilapidation and decay inside the building was creating gaping holes in the floor that would sometimes go several floors down into the dark. Doors fallen from hinges, graffiti, glass strewn over the floors, and half-full filing cabinets filled the place. With that image set, some friends and I were exploring the 4th floor of the main building not far from the central bell tower. It was probably after 1 a.m. and all we had were our phone flashlights that barely showed more than 10 feet in front of you. We came into an open room and in the slight light there was a glint in the middle of the room. We moved in closer to get a good look at what was there. It was an old patient's chair complete with leather wrist straps. Under it, a pentagram painted onto the floor in red paint. 3 feet in front of it, the petrified carcass of a cat. This room was covered in graffiti referencing the devil, dying, and screaming. It was a freaky ducking find. Everyone in the group but me and another guy pretty much bailed at that point. I overcame the fear long enough to sit in the chair for a picture, then we started making our way out. Not long after leaving the room we heard some thumping noise from the floor above us, and being we were spooked already, we got the duck out of there in a half run, just fast enough to not fall through the floor in the massive holes. I never went back to that room ever again. Despite going back the asylum a few times after, that room is the scariest thing I ever experienced. While exploring my grandpa's ranch, he had stopped raising dairy cattle and milking them, had roughly 100 dairy cows, about 16 years ago. He also used to breed and raise good ranch horses, had 45 horses, and he had about 400 beef cattle, now down to 100. Since then he has one horse left, 24-year-old black gelding, who he used to rodeo on. His best friend in horse form, which is why he hasn't sold him ever. The reason why he stopped with the dairy cows and horse business was because the economy dropped so drastically, he had to pick and choose what he could afford to keep doing. Also, he had 2 heart attacks, related to his stress levels of running a ranch with just himself and my aunt helping. He still grows and sells hay. I was pretty young, but I remember seeing all his horses out in huge meadows, with foals, baby horses, that would run up to you to see you, and all his cattle spread out across the hundreds of acres. I remember the dairy cows, and seeing one of them have a calf. I was about 4 years old. Anyway, I was exploring the old dairy section of the ranch. It is very eerie, especially at dawn and dusk. I was out there at dusk, and the old light outside the milking barn is still on, it never turns off. I found a calendar on the wall inside the barn, and it was on May 1996. Never moved since then. There is still grain on the floor, still water in the troughs. I stumbled upon a couple dead cats inside the barn, and a dead cow right outside the barn, near where he let the dairy cows out into a meadow every day. Inside the milk barn, there is an upstairs. I don't go up there because you will fall through floorboards. But, I heard footsteps above me, and it scared the hell out of me. My great-great-grandpa bought this ranch, and he died on the ranch, along with great-grandpa, and I'm sure my grandpa will too. He is 78 currently. I believe they are still there as spirits, doing their routine on the ranch. My family started the ranch probably around 120 to 130 years ago. There's this place in the northern Adirondacks called Taos. It's a twice abandoned ghost town that my mother was fascinated with. We went there seemingly every other month. The houses would degrade more and more, but one would always stay the same. The Roosevelt Cabin. It was maintained because of how important it is to history, and although it was supposed to be, it was never locked. We'd gone in there dozens of times, but the last time was when I decided to stop going to Taos for good. I don't know why, and for those who don't believe in ghosts, this might not sound real, but it felt so strange when I entered, like the feeling you get when you're silent in a room full of people yelling and fighting. Then suddenly, a chill went down my spine and I had a vision, things that aren't rare for me, of myself hanging from a rope on the second story with the ground broken beneath me. Typical horror movie dumbass here, I decided to go up on the second story anyway. I'm not sure what room it was, maybe a bedroom, but the floor felt unstable there. It would creak and shift and moan like it would give out any second. Then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a rope, and I couldn't stop myself from running away in terror. My family kept asking me why I never wanted to go back, because they said it was our town, but it isn't, and never should have been. That town belongs to something else, something that didn't want us there. If you ever want to go there, it's near Newcomb in New York. Look it up, and be careful. I'm never going back, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Despite my belief that it's haunted, the town is beautiful. Just watch out for rattlesnakes on those trails, and unless you have the stomach for hauntings, do not go in the Roosevelt Cabin. Many years ago, there was an abandoned water filtration plant in St. Charles County, Missouri that local kids referred to variously as the Aquadome/Equidome/Equidome. It was a collection of buildings used during World War II in conjunction with a nearby munitions plant. In 1989, a boyfriend and I went exploring the place. I loved abandoned places, so he suggested we go, and this was all very exciting. There was of course the ubiquitous pentagrams, graffiti, questionable dead animals and references to Satan, but I was mainly interested in the architecture and industrial remnants. Apart from some structural safety issues, not much scared me until I reached a spot with a meter-square hole in the concrete floor, with hell scrawled above it in red spray paint, and a downward pointing arrow. I laughed off the cliché until I crouched down and shone my flashlight into the abyss below. There, in the dark, about 15 feet down, was some standing water covered in what looked to be hundreds upon hundreds of bright orange puffballs, about the size of baseballs. I took one glance, and noped the duck out of there so fast it made my head spin. Found my BF Jason nearby and had him take a look. He too, noped the duck out. This was a 6 feet 4 inches, fearless, punk rock dude that people generally didn't mess with. We left after that. Today, the Equidome is long gone and the area has been leveled and turned into a police shooting practice range. To this day, I wonder what the hell I saw down there in the dark. Some kind of fungus? Strange mystery apparatus used in water treatment? Aliens? No one knows. Me and a friend took a shortcut while walking at night and came to a really neat park. It had a playground, monkey bars, seesaws and other crazy contraptions, and had large walls running parallel on either side with a crappy metal fence toward the way back that led to a canal, kinda like a cul-de-sac or a funnel. It was dimly lit but kinda nice, so we stayed and goofed off for a while and started coming here on the weekends thereafter, always at night for some reason. There was an abandoned apartment complex on one end and a row of really old houses that might as well just be abandoned, that just made the park feel so isolated, but we liked it so we kept coming back. One night we were both chilling quietly. I was lying on a bench and he on the grass, and we heard noise. It was maybe 2 or 3 a.m. and we knew people didn't live in the complex and it was too late for the people who lived in the houses to be out, so we grew alert. We heard mumbling but the park was too dim to see anyone. We stayed quiet and we heard it again on the other side of the park. There was grass but we didn't hear footsteps. We both started freaking out a little, but after a couple of times it just stopped. We waited a couple of minutes and bolted. We were so curious the next day that we went back in the morning to check it out. When we got there we realized we've never been here during the day, and I could have sworn it seemed there were more trees at night. One of the walls had a few cinder blocks missing, so we peeked to the other side and realized that it was as a cemetery. My friend got a little spooked thinking about what had happened the day before and started walking around until he stepped on a large piece of flesh on the ground. We checked it out and it looked like a thick femur with some meat still attached. We both got spooked and started to walk away wondering if it could have been human or animal when we noticed more flesh on the grass, intestines. Upon realizing there was more, we widened our field of scope and found more stuff, a small pouch with an eye, kidneys, a heart and a pig's head, all around the park right where we were hearing the noises. We never came back. This happened maybe 4 years ago. Not a building, but a graveyard in an old abandoned coal town called Red Ash. This place is notoriously haunted and there are multiple stories, sightings of apparitions, and paranormal activity in the area. There's multiple legends about a graveyard of child coal miners, a woman who cries over her grave every night, the spirits of coal miners walking along the train tracks, a witch's shack, and a demonic goat man, among other things. There's legit so many stories about this place, and if you ask anyone in my area they'll tell you about it. Most people actually avoid this area because of the stories, but mostly because it's on a back road with one-lane bridges and potholes. But not dumb teens, and my friends and I just so happen to have been dumb teens. So one night I was driving around with a couple of friends when we just started talking about the place. Friend A and I had never been there, so friend B insisted we go right then. This place is like a 30-ish minute drive from where we all live, so friend A and I were like, yeah sure, let's go. So we drive all the way out in this deep neck of the woods in tiny, 2-door Mini Cooper with the intention of finding all the legends, starting with the graveyard. We never got past the graveyard. We all got out of the car once we found the graveyard, and started looking around for any signs of the paranormal, all of us jumpy as hell because it's like 2 a.m, we keep hearing footsteps in the woods, probably Goatman, and the only adequate light we had was our phone flashlights. We try to take our time and I split off from our terrified group huddle to look around. Friend A and B are looking around one side of the graveyard and I make my way to the other. Note, the graveyard is very small, we were maybe 20 feet from each other when we were roaming around. It was mostly us saying stuff like, found anything yet? Just this baby snake, no, keep that over there. But then I noticed this set of 2 twin headstones that are very old, and the writing on them is weathered, but otherwise are still standing. They were particularly interesting because they were twin stones, probably a couple. They were about 1 wide and 3 tall, both on one base, so these stones were close to 4 in height. Most of the stones were in-ground or very small headstones, as I said before, mostly the stones of children or the poor. I circled the base of the headstones, starting at the front. I come back around and begin to walk away when the left stone literally breaks in half and falls towards me. It hits the ground with a loud thump, which is what alerted me to the stone having fell. It was a horizontal break, but these stones had no cracks, and I didn't touch the stones in the slightest. I jump, turn, and scream at the same time. Both friend A and friend B scream. Friend A whips around to see what happened while friend B just guns it straight to the car. I also began running, grabbing friend A so B doesn't decide to drive off without us. Friend B dives headfirst into the back seat from the passenger side. Friend A jumps into the driver's side and I throw the front seat backwards and hop in while B's legs are still hanging out the door, now trapped between the seat and the door frame. We drive off with the passenger door still open, and I'm holding as closed as it will go with B's legs still hanging out. As we're driving, I pull my seat up so B can actually get into the car. I'm actually laughing my ass off now that I'm thinking about this again. We're all traumatized, shook even. But now we're filled with questions and gushing with adrenaline, so we do the stupid thing of turning around and going back to the graveyard to find that the top half of the stone is completely missing now. There was maybe 10 minutes between us leaving and coming back, and in that time the piece of the tombstone that broke off has completely disappeared. We decide we've had enough and leave for the night. We've went back a few times after that and it's always spooky, but we've never had quite the encounter as our first visit. I actually plan to buy some cheap ghost hunting equipment and have those friends go back out with me, because this place is a goldmine of spooks.